Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jalen and today I am going over every single one of my all-time favorite books as of today. I'm also going to be discussing a potential reread TBR or challenge for myself to sort of put these books to the test and see if they truly are my favorites. I think that they will remain that way, but some of these books I read 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm curious to know now that I feel like I'm such a different reader than I was back then, whether my opinion will still be the same or if it will change at all. But with the books that I picked from that older bucket, I think that my opinion will remain the same. So let's just hop right into it. This is not going to be really a review of the books. I'm just going to give you why I love them and kind of keep moving from there. But to start, I have to start with my queen, Ottessa Moshfegh. So here's my stack of her books. Here's my collection of Ottessa Moshfegh's work. It's too much, but I'll quickly go over why I have this many. So I have McGlue. I have 3 copies of My Year in Rest and Relaxation. One is just the hardcover that I bought back in the day. The publisher sent me a paperback, and I also received a signed first edition of My Year of Rest and Relaxation from my parents for Christmas. I think it was last year. She is signed, and proof that it's a first edition. No one's touching this book. I'm having it for the rest of my life. That kind of thing. And then I just have my general hardcover that I initially read. I have Homesick for Another World in hardcover. I have Eileen in hardcover. I found this used somewhere, and I don't know if it's a first edition. It is. I didn't even know that. First edition Eileen hardcover. Hell yeah. I think I got this for $8 or something. That's a win. And then also, Death in Her Hands Arc. This is my favorite Ottessa Moshfegh book. I know it's an unpopular opinion, but this was also the first arc that I ever received. I didn't really have a big following. I know it wasn't really book talk taking over the Moshfegh love train, but yeah, this book I love so much. I've annotated the hell out of it for me. This is a book that I have already reread once in my life. I also have a signed first edition of Death in Her Hands as well. And I have my general, again, hardcover that I purchased myself when the book came out to support the dolls. I also have her singular short story called My New Novel by Ottessa Moshfegh. But it was put out by Emma Klein with this imprint that she's working with. I believe it's called Gagosian. And it also comes with a picture called The Down Payment by Issy Wood that goes with it. So there's a picture in here. I'm not going to open it right now because I'm lazy. And then the story. So I love this. Great collector's item. It was very expensive for a single story. I think it was $40. And I don't think that they're printing this anymore. I think this might be out of print, but I could be wrong. I will link it if it's available, but I think it's a done deal. And then finally, I have Let Vona Arc, which comes out June 21st. And I have a separate video review for this book if you are so interested. I wanted to start with this because recently I was watching Anna Wallace Johnson, and she did a video about rereading that I really enjoyed, and her thinking about books that she wants to pick up again that are favorites of hers, or she just wants to dabble in them and see if her opinion has changed. And so that kind of sparked my want to revisit my favorites. I have a favorite shelf up there out of shot, and I want to see or have this as a time capsule of books that I have loved in my life and reflect on it, and then maybe in a year or two go back and see what I think, and then reread some of these that I'm really keen to. So that is a plan with this video. And to start with all the Moshfeghs, I'm actually embarking on a vlog journey. I don't often vlog on this channel, but I'm going to reread all of Ottessa Moshfegh's books, vlog the experience, give my ranking of them all, my thoughts. It'll be my love letter to Ottessa Moshfegh. So that is coming down the line. If you are interested, keep an eye out. I still have to read all of the books again. Aside from that, here is the mighty stack of favorites. So let's just get into it. It's going to be a longer video, so I hope you enjoy this. Okay, to start, I want to share 2 books that I've never really talked about on this channel, I don't think ever. They're the 2 books that I sort of credit with getting me back into reading back in 2018. So I've always been a reader all of my life. Kind of growing up, I read Fear Street and Goosebumps. I loved little horror books growing up. I loved vampire books. So R.L. Stine had this series called Dangerous Women or something about vampires, and I was obsessed. And I still have a bit of a horror or dark bent in my reading now, but aside from that, I went to college, didn't really read much except for a couple of Stephen Kings every once in a while. I thought he was my favorite writer for a long time, and then sort of going into, I was in law school, and I took a trip to Portland and went to Powell's Books, and I picked up The Secret History, And this was immediately after I had dabbled in Harry Potter as well. So it was like a blend of The Secret History and Harry Potter that I attribute to getting me back into reading. Shortly following up was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. So to start with The Secret History, I found this copy at Powell's. It's a hardcover copy. I wonder if this is a first edition. I highly doubt it. That's odd. This says it's a second printing before publication, which I don't really get what that means. If you know what that means, let me know. But anyways, started reading this on the plane and going home, and I could not put it down. I loved the sort of whodunit of the mystery at the center of this. I loved the campus novel feel. It feels very dark and like autumnal, and I love that. And this is a book that Anna Wallace-Johnson also mentioned she wants to reread. So I think we're going to be doing a buddy read of this closer to the fall. And I'm really, really keen to go back into Donna Tartt's writing because I just remember being so in love with this. And it's sort of like, it was more literary than I had been used to at the time. I mostly read, as I mentioned, like Stephen King and like the occasional. I was kind of more like all over the place with what I would pick up with my reading. And now I tend to read like 90% literary fiction, I would say. So I'm very excited to see how I feel about this. I know this book is very love or hate online. I know this book is constantly like in favorite piles, and also some people hate this book. Anyways, that's A Secret History. I'm very excited to reread that one. And then also I have East of Eden by John Steinbeck. After I read this book, this is a long book too. This is like 600 pages, I want to say. So for a while, this had been the longest book I've ever read, and I hadn't really read too many classics, but I think I was on like Reddit at the time, and I looked up, or I kept seeing threads about this book being like, this is the best book ever written, etc. And so I picked it up myself, and I can confidently say this is one of the most like, this just feels like a novel to me. You know what I mean? Like this is the perfect example to me of storytelling, true like ambition in storytelling, which I think is something that of late I've been reading more like contemporary fiction that seems to be a little bit less plot focused or a little bit more micro in scope. And I really appreciated this as like a huge family saga is doing so much in terms of its look at faith and religion and humanity, and looking at these two families and how they kind of come together and throughout this narrative. I think it's so well done, and Kathy is one of the most memorable characters I've ever read. This is another one that I would love to reread and see how I feel about it now, but this book absolutely fucking slaps. Like, it's everything. And I don't think I've ever really talked about this book on my channel before, so if you've ever wondered before BookTube what I liked, this is a book that I adore. Okay, and so I actually forgot to include one more book. This is actually like the oldest, I would say, favorite on my shelves, and that's Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This is a book that I read in senior year of high school. I used this book on the AP literature exam, and I passed, so there's that. But this book, I remember just being so rich and dense and complex, and my little senior brain was blown away. I remember my close friend in high school, we were in the same class together, and we were reading this at the same time. It was like for a summer reading, and I remember going over to her house, and we, no shit, talked about this book for like 4 hours, up until 2 a.m., talking about like the symbolism and themes and what is going on in this book. Again, we were young, so who knows what that conversation was, and I'm sure it was poor and not very intellectually rich, but I would love to reread this one and see where I stand on it now. I know it is a modern classic, and I would love to dabble in it again. So that's another one that I forgot to mention. Okay, so going to like my journey of being online and book reviewing, and I started getting into reading, and then I wasn't really online. I was just reading in law school, and then like on my personal account, I would post about books, but like no one would engage with me because no one I know in real life really reads at all. And so like I remember looking up, I think it was like The Secret History or something, and then I found Bookstagram, and I was like, what is this? Like, people are on the internet talking about books and like sharing pictures of them and just like vibing every day with books online and like seeking community. And I was like, okay, you know what? I'm doing it. So then I started the bar and the bookcase. As I mentioned, I'm a lawyer. I do love a beer or a glass of wine while I read. And so it was a double entendre. I was like, you know what? I'm the lawyer bar and the alcohol bar and the bookcase. And so that's where that all came from. But there was like a year where I was on Bookstagram only, and then I realized that I really wanted to vocalize and seek discussion with other people verbally. And so that initially grew to being BookTube, and then from there it grew to now I have a podcast on my channel that I'm soon going to be bringing to podcast services as well. And so I'm really loving the actual community and discussion aspect of having a book club and the podcast and all of that. All that to say, some of these books I read closer to like 2 years ago. Some of them are newer that I just feel will stand the test of time for me, but who knows, we'll see. Anyways, okay, so going into like Bookstagram phase, when I discovered some books that I think are still some of my favorites, I have 4. First up, I have my favorite book of 2020. It is Real Life by Brandon Taylor. This book means a ton to me for many reasons. After reading it, I'd realized that I hadn't really read too many queer books, which is really interesting because I myself am a queer man. I don't really know why that is. I tend to read a lot of books written by women and loving like female narrators in books, but I hadn't really sought out queer stuff, and I don't know why that is, but this is one that I picked up. I had seen some early buzz of this book. I think it was Roxane Gay gave like a 5-star review on Goodreads or something, and I was like, oh, this sounds great. This book is one that I think is so emotionally rich, and I loved the plays with structure that Brandon Taylor does in this book that it's still stick in my mind, and I loved the exploration of a very fraught queer relationship in this, and then centering it over one weekend in a summer in which our main character Wallace is dealing with a bunch of different confrontations with his peers, and the sort of like aesthetic vibe of this book as well, I think blends all of these themes together so beautifully, and it was a really good, like, eye-opening book for me in terms of what I like to read in literary fiction. From there, this book means a lot to me because I followed Brandon Taylor on Twitter after that, and he is like one of the, you might not follow him yourself, he is one of the funniest book people on Twitter. He has a huge following, and now he writes his own criticism, and he's since published a short story collection, and he's just a really exciting writer for me to be following, and I get so many recommendations from him. He follows me, which is crazy, but this book I always think of fondly, and I have read this book twice, and I loved it both times. Next up is the one, the only, Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor. I picked this up as soon as it was published. Like, I think it was the day it came out, I picked it up because I'd seen a few one-off reviews on Instagram saying, like, this book is one of the most, like, depraved and violent and tough to get through books, but it's so rewarding in a certain sense as well, and this is before it had the immense buzz that it has now. Again, opened my eyes to different ways of telling stories, so this book is told in essentially 4 different paragraphs. Very long, run-on sentences, really claustrophobic and violent and depraved, as I mentioned, looking at violence within a small impoverished town in Mexico, looking at femicide, namely, while also looking at many other things in this town, but toxic masculinity and poverty in this town. And I've never really read a book that has this sort of like true crime feel that also has 4 different perspectives that is told in this really singular voice. It comes together by the end to really just leave you completely gutted. This book, I cannot wait to reread this again because I recently read her latest book called Paradise, which just came out. That one feels like a more micro novel compared to this one. This one is a little bit more macro in approach of looking at a town, while Paradise is looking at one sort of like housing complex and 2 characters within it. But this one has a bunch of different moving parts, and it's really ambitious and interesting. Fernanda Melchor is a writer that I will follow forever. Next is a book that I find is quite underrated, in my opinion. It's Apartment by Teddy Wayne. This book is one of like the first MFA ebooks that I read, and I tend to find that I like books that look at students that are like pursuing an MFA or just kind of are deep in like academia, I would say. And this is one of the first that I read in that vein, but this one really surprised me in how shocked I was by the end of this book. And this book is not one that is violent at all, but just sort of the reveals that happen and the character study of our narrator here was really original and something I hadn't really read before. We follow these 2 students for this MFA program, and this book really looks at the differences between them. Our narrator seems to be failing at writing, while Billy, the other student, he is succeeding really well, but he's poor, while our student is not, or not as much as Billy is. And they end up moving in together, and it's about this pursuit of writing and career and success, and what can happen to someone's ego, or in that sort of environment, and the fallout that ensues. Touches of like pretentiousness, but I really loved how surprising this was, and I loved the narrator, the exploration of the narrator, and how subtly dark this book up at the end of it. So good, underrated. Please read it. Next up is Sisters by Daisy Johnson. And this book reminded me how much I enjoy, when it's good for me, literary thrillers and the use of surprise and atmosphere in a novel to really pay off, and darkness as well. As I mentioned, I really do tend to love dark aspects in novels, but sometimes it's hard for me to find books that do it in a way that's fulfilling to me, I guess, as a reader, and this one really did. Essentially, we follow these 2 sisters who move into this new decrepit house with their mother, and so this is a quite gothic novel looking at these 2 sisters and their very weird power dynamics within their relationship together, and also the strange behavior of their mom in this house, and how she seems to be sort of reclusive, while these 2 sisters are really engaging in increasingly violent behavior with each other and certain games together. And this book, I won't spoil it, but there are twists and turns that I was not expecting, but it's truly, I think, the definition for me of a literary thriller in terms of how complex this book looks at sister dynamics, parental-child dynamics within a very gothic and interesting and sinister atmosphere. Loved this so much. The writing is gorgeous, so evocative, and just really thrilling to read, and I love that. Finally, I'm going into more recent reads that have just really stuck in my mind ever since I've read them. The first one is a short story collection. I think it's the only collection in this pile, I'm pretty sure. But it is I Hold a Wolf by the Ears by Laura Vandenberg. Oh, except for Otessa Moshfegh's story collection. That's also in my favorites. But this one has sort of been like the gold standard for me for short stories ever since I read this book. I think I read it in like December of 2020. Every single story is perfectly constructed and really taps into ideas and feelings or evoke certain emotions or like suspense in me as I'm reading it that I just love to read in short stories. And I think she is a masterful use of escalation through her short stories. Weird is not the word for it. They're all very sort of like surreal in their telling. They're often looking at women on the edge. The way that she plays with certain narrators' minds and also the different structures of relationships around most of these women are really interesting in how she plays with surprise given these dynamics. And I'll just read from this synopsis. This is probably better than any sort of summary I can give you of the stories myself. But for example, it says, in Lizards, a man mutes his wife's anxieties by giving her a LaCroix-like seltzer laced with sedatives. In the title story, a woman poses her more successful sister during a botched Italian holiday, a choice that brings about strange and destructive consequences. While in Carolina, a woman discovers her prickly ex-sister-in-law in the aftermath of an earthquake and is forced to face the truth about her violent brother. Often very fraught, weird relationships that are at the root of these stories that are also really played with well in terms of setting. A lot of the stories in this collection are set in Florida, and like the weirdness that Florida brings to her stories I think is really interesting. Brilliant scene setter and prose stylist, I think, and her sentences are just fucking perfect. Like this, I love this book so much if you can't tell. And this is one that is going on my reread TBR as well. I need to reread this, and I always recommend this for anyone looking for short stories that are on the darker side of things, and if you like surprise in your stories and escalation, I think she's the best doing it right now for me. I will stick on the theme of short stories. This is at the tippity top of my list of like favorite books I've ever read. This book was a game changer for me in terms of my approach to reading generally, but also in particular reading short stories and also thinking about how to review and think about books critically. A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders is a collection of 7 Russian short stories in which he gives you the classics, but in between each story, he gives you some sort of essay in which he analyzes why he thinks the stories work so well. George Saunders is a creative writing professor at Syracuse University, and this is, in short, a book that you can purchase, which is essentially like a lecture that he's given, or a group of lectures that he gives at Syracuse University. What he does in this collection through the criticism is really make you as a reader question your assumptions and your ideas as you're reading these short stories. I find that when people talk about short stories, they often say like, well, like it was forgettable, or as a collection they all kind of blended together. Those sort of criticisms, and people often tell me that they don't like them for that reason, or that it's too short so they can't get invested. And George Saunders really makes you question those opinions that you might have given on books in the past, and makes you wonder, like, is it short stories as a form, or is it just the short stories that you're reading that aren't as good as they could be, maybe? And this book really looks at this idea, as I mentioned before, of escalation in short stories, and wondering, how does a story differ from a novel, and how they're ultimately a means to an end? A story has to end at a certain place and give you a sense of fulfillment by the end of it. And how do you do that? One tool is through escalating throughout the story to constantly keep the reader engaged, and then also make sure the story ends at a place where it needs to. I think novels are a different platform to be a little bit more experimental, and I think George Saunders makes the case for, well, I kind of take that back. He doesn't say that you can't experiment within the short story form, but there are certain tools in short story writing that I think are very unique to the form, and this book really unpacks that. But I will say, it might sound like a college lesson, but this book is really so damn fun to read. George Saunders' voice in the essays just jumps off the page. He seems so happy while writing it, and you really get that when you're reading the book. I myself, I love being a student, so this kind of felt like I was going back to school and learning about like my favorite thing, which is books and reading. And so it was just a pure like joyful experience while also learning so much about my own assumptions about reading and all of that. So that is that one. Adore it. Next up, I have 2 books by Sheila Heti. These I recently read. One is Pure Color, and then one is Motherhood. I think Motherhood is my favorite, but I really can't decide between the two of these books. All I know is that Sheila Heti is one of my favorite writers working right now. She, out of all these writers, I think, plays with ideas and preoccupations and anxieties that I have living in this flesh prison, and she puts them on the page in a really interesting way. And I find her books are unputdownable, often and don't have much of a plot going on in them, but I think the way that she tackles ideas and philosophy in her books is so intriguing to me. And I know some readers don't tend to like when their books sort of are deeply philosophical and look at these insights, but it's something that I really enjoy seeing a writer grapple with on the page, and also using autofiction, namely in Motherhood. It's another subgenre of books that I've been really enjoying in terms of like novelistic structure and figuring out what novels that I love are doing, and I tend to find that a lot of them are kind of in this autofiction basket. Anyways, she is like my philosophy queen, and I just love her writing. I feel like she's just blowing my mind every time I read her books, and it's something that's very singular to her writing. And as soon as I finished each of these books, I was like, this is a new favorite of mine of all time. And that's not like often a response that I have immediately to a book, but for both of these, that was my response. I think that only means one thing. She's a favorite, you know? Next book I have for you is The Life of the Mind by Christine Smallwood. And this book, well, it matches my outfit, but also it was a book that I read while I was in Amsterdam in August of 2021. This was a really interesting book to like read in a travel-y space. Essentially, this is a, as my friend CJ has dubbed, a depressed woman moving novel. And I think this is the most depressed woman moving through the world novel that I've ever read in my experience. I know like my year of rest and relaxation is sort of like the blueprint, I would say, in my mind, but this one really is like that to a T. This is a book that grabbed me from the first sentence, and I'll read it for you, and hopefully it grabs you as well. It is: Dorothy was taking a shit at the library when her therapist called, and she let it go to voicemail. Also, it's very Moshfeghian, the poop, you know what I mean? The poop going on in Moshfegh is interesting through line there. But I think it's a really good way of grabbing readers' attention, is looking to the body. And I think this book is very much thinking about the body and its functions, because we quickly learn on the first page of this book that Dorothy has had a miscarriage. And the rest of this book is sort of this unraveling of Dorothy's mind, thinking about what it means to have had a miscarriage for herself, and also thinking about herself and her career and her life. And so this book, similar to like Sheila Heti, I think, really explores philosophical musings on these things, but also looks at fiction in the novel form, while also having a narrator that is very much a narrator that I love to read, in terms of being very much in her head and very thinky and depressed and moving through the world, as I mentioned. So this book is one that I desperately need to reread, because there are certain things in this book. It's truly like a brainy and intellectual book by the end of it. There's certain like allusions, and I would really love to read this again to see when I'm not like in a travel-y space, like on airplanes, tired and jet lagged, like what I would get from this. But it was also kind of like a cool way to read this book too. The book is very smart, funny as hell, dark, and I loved it so much. And sort of like underrated, I think. I feel like more people should read this book. I haven't really seen it around enough. The next book I have is Assembly by Natasha Brown. This one is a book that stands in my mind as a favorite because I think what Natasha Brown does, it's also a depressed woman moving novel, but really has a certain sense of stakes and uses brevity to her advantage in a way that I've never really read in a book before. This book, I guess, has allusions to Mrs. Dalloway, which is a book that I have not read myself, but essentially we follow a successful Black woman who works in finance, and she has a boyfriend, and it's all leading up to a certain party at her boyfriend's parents' house by the end of the book. And so we follow our narrator as she's thinking about her life and her place in the world leading up to this party by the end of the novel, right? But there's something that is revealed in this book that adds a certain sense of stakes and really adds a certain sense of like suspense, and it's gutting. And I don't really want to spoil it. It's been talked about a lot online, so you might already know what it is. I kind of wanted to tell you, but I won't. Just go into it knowing that there's stakes in it, and it really helps give some more, or I guess I would say like in certain depressed woman moving fiction books, I guess less successful ones, it's often just a woman thinking about things, and that's, you know, that's fine, has its own merit, and I still love reading that. But this one gives the narrator a certain sense of autonomy that's really interesting. As soon as I read it, I was like, holy shit, like this is wild and original and a really good take on sort of subgenre of fiction that's going around right now. Anyways, this is like a single sitting read. Please read it if you haven't already. It's incredible. Her sentences are amazing. Like, it's just so good. Next up, I have a book called Wayward by Dana Spiotta. This is a book that I think is criminally underrated, but she is also a creative writing professor at Syracuse University, along with George Saunders. And I picked this book up, or I requested it because he is the first blurb on this book. But to keep it brief, this is a book that's all about a mother-daughter dynamic and also looking at a woman that's going through menopause and using this sort of like, again, depressed woman moving sort of trope, but gives a new perspective in terms of an older woman who makes a very spontaneous decision to purchase a house. And she purchases this house and she's married, and she doesn't really realize until after she buys it that she wants to have a new lease on life. And the book really looks at what that does to her daughter, who is a teenager. What I love so much about it is its form. It uses a very interesting approach in terms of structure and sort of alternating perspectives throughout the book that I really thought was so brilliantly done, and how it gradually reveals itself throughout the book. And also looking at this idea of a home and a new start, and really thinking about what the human capacity is for change by looking through this older woman and her perspective. Really, really interesting, and a book that I need to reread as well. I'm going to talk about two of these sort of together because they kind of go together in a certain way. I picked up the classic because of the newer book, but they are Crossroads and Middlemarch. So first up, I will start with Crossroads. This is the first in Jonathan Franzen's planned trilogy called A Key to All Mythologies. And side note, I actually have an individual book review of this book on my channel. That's also an indication if I really fucking love a book, I'm going to do an individual book review. They're very rare, but that's a good sign that it's going to be a favorite of mine. That review has a ton of views, and that's really scary. I read an arc of this, and so I was like the first YouTube review of the book, and it was very nerve-wracking because Jonathan Franzen is a huge name in literary fiction. This is the first book I read of his. I've since read the corrections and his essay collection called How to Be Alone. I definitely prefer his fiction, but all of his writing is so damn good, and this is my favorite book of his by far. Very long and dense family saga looking at this family in 1971 who are affiliated with the church, and this look at how they're all at a certain crossroads in their lives. And this book really looks at these different structures, whether it be religion or responsibility to a family unit, and how that plays on each member of this family, and how they sort of deal with those conflicts amongst each other, all on one day, essentially, December 23rd or Christmas Eve. Most of the book is set on that single day, and we jump between perspectives for very long periods of time. But I will say, this is hands down like my favorite family saga, I would say. All of these characters are like people that I feel like I know, in a sense, and I think it's in one part due to Jonathan Franzen's skill as a writer, but also I think something that kind of comes with reading longer books such as this. And with Middlemarch, you necessarily have to like live with these characters for a longer time, and you learn more about them if a writer's doing a good job, I guess. And all that to say, I think these characters are just so like, I think a book is special when you feel like characters kind of become a part of you in a sense, and that's what this book feels like to me. Like I really feel I know them. I feel like they are people that I've experienced in my life. You have to be a good writer to do that. The book is called A Key to All Mythologies, which is actually a reference to George Eliot's Middlemarch, in which we have one man in this book. His name is I call him Mr. Casaubon because the audiobook that I listened to called him that, but I've heard also Mr. Casaubon. He is trying to write this really deep, long theological text, The Key to Life, essentially. And aside from that, this book is looking at a small town in 1829 with certain political things that are going on that are changing. Look at a bunch of different characters within this town and different motivations. We have marriages, we have deaths, we have wills in which people fuck each other over in the wills. There's so much drama and juiciness, but we also get a character in here, Dorothea Brooke, who's married to Mr. Casaubon, as I mentioned, and we see her trying to strive for more as a woman in this time, and how she has to try to do it through Mr. Casaubon, who's trying to draft this Key to All Mythologies, and she's trying to help him in his work do that. And I think it's really interesting how Jonathan Franzen references that in here in terms of using a different structure, namely a family versus a small town, and seeing how he's not saying seriously that he's going to like write a trilogy that is like unpacking everything about humanity. There's no way that he's doing that. But I think it's kind of funny in terms of him using that as a reference point. It's really interesting. And so I had heard a lot about Middlemarch, and due to reading Crossroads, I ended up picking this up. And this book blew me away again in terms of its form and its structure. And this is the hands down longest book that I've ever read in my life. But I'm so happy I did, because I see how it informs so many of the books that I just talked about here. These certain ideas of approaching the novel as a form itself. And I love when fiction does that. I love when a novel feels like it's intentionally using the form to do something. And I feel like all of these books here are using the novel in a way that to me feels exciting and innovative, or just something that really causes me to think and consider my own approach to reading novels and why I do it. And this is sort of like the blueprint of that, I think, in a really long sense. But also aside from that, I think this is probably like the best on a technical level written book that I've ever read in my life. Her prose is just, there's no Like, there's nothing to touch here. Like, it's just damn good. But anyway, so let's do those two. Oh, I forgot one. Okay, hold on. I have 3 more, everyone. Sorry. It's Sally Rooney's Beautiful World, Where Are You? Sally Rooney is a writer that I love so much. I think her books are ones that when you pick them up, at least for me, I cannot put them down at all. They're such, like, treats to read. They're very easy to digest. And we often have really interesting relationships and miscommunications that I love reading about in millennial fiction. And I just really like her approach to writing relationships and thinking about like the psychology of interpersonal relationships. But aside from that, this book I love so much because, again, as I mentioned, it's using the novel and questioning its form through the essay sections of this book. In case you don't know, this book is split between exposition in certain chapters, and then every other chapter is an email correspondence between 2 of the characters in this book. And in that, we get some auto-fictional writing from Sally Rooney about being a successful novelist and what it means to pursue writing a new book, given some like newfound acclaim and what the novel is doing in this time, COVID, namely also like capitalism, what it means to be writing in this period and what it means to try to live a beautiful life and what is the point of living when there's so much bleakness in the world. And I think this book really tackles that question in an interesting and new way for Rooney while still feeling and paying like homage to normal people and conversations with friends stylistically and thematically. But I think this one is a little bit more of a flex on Rooney's part and her really questioning her own place as a writer through the text. And I love that in fiction, as I mentioned. So there's that one. And then finally, I want to talk about these 2 books together. They're not really like related in my mind, but there's a connection. Bear with me. One is Detransition Baby by Tori Peters, and the other is Fake Accounts by Lauren Euler. I'll start with Detransition Baby. I wanted to talk about it after talking about Franzen because I read Lauren Euler's review of this book, and in it she made a reference or compared this book to Franzen. And at the time, I had never read Franzen before. It was another one of those references that I was like, I need to read this dude to see like what people are getting at, like the kind of jokiness behind making certain comparisons. But I saw Lauren, she said like in a tweet or something, she said she meant it like in a good way because she thinks Franzen's good. But this book I think is so interesting in its use of queer voices in fiction and sort of uses the love triangle that's really interesting and queer and new and something that I found so exciting and invigorating to read. I tend to love books that follow a certain love triangle. As I mentioned, Sally Rooney. I love seeing those sort of dynamics, but this one follows a trans woman, a man who has since detransitioned, and their relationship to each other. And also Ames, the man who's detransitioned, he is in a relationship with his boss who gets pregnant. And from there, this book is really examining queer dynamics, thinking about parenthood and finding a purpose in your life, but also kind of throwing a wrench in this with these queer identities in the book that I think is so interesting. And I loved the writing and the examination of like gender theory in this book that I think is so cool to read. And I think she's just an excellent writer. And I ate this book up. It was such a romp, but also really like intellectual. And I think like upon reflection, I can kind of see where Lauren was getting at with comparing this book to Franzen. And now I need to reread this book now that I've read some Franzen to see how I think about it now too, just to see how like the through lines there that I think will be entertaining for me to parse out. There's that one. And then finally, I have Fake Accounts by Lauren Euler. This is the book that I saved for last because I feel like this is the book I have hands down talked about the most on my channel. And I've gotten certain like pushback on this book or like different responses from readers about them not loving this book as much as I do. It's all really interesting, but I think this one is one of those books that uses autofiction and examines the contemporary literary landscape in a really interesting way and uses this sort of depressed expat fiction in a fun way. But what I love the most about this book is Lauren's explorations of fiction and fiction writing through this book. There's a certain section in this book that when I read this book as I was reading it last year, I was like, oh, this is the shit. There's essentially a part in which she starts writing in fragmentary style and starts critiquing the form as she's writing it. And those sort of like meta auto-fictional plays on the novel form, I just loved reading this book and really exploring this interesting narrator that I think is similarly used in a lot of contemporary fiction, but Lauren seems to be on the page exploring all these things while also looking at how social media and the internet sort of plays with people's personalities and how they represent themselves to other people and the weird aspects of the internet, while also looking at it through a novelistic form, which feels like a more traditional form compared to like social media and Instagram posting. And she blends them in a way that just completely blew my mind. I feel like it's such a good distillation of everything that I love in fiction. I think it has suspense. The setup to this book is we follow a woman who discovers that her boyfriend is an online right-wing conspiracy theorist and how she sort of responds to that. But the book isn't really like a thriller in the sense that it might sound like. It's really this exploration of the internet and social media and selfhood all through this examination of what a novel can be. And the reason I also saved this one for last is because this book kind of felt to me like the impetus of my realization about what I like about certain fiction. And I think it's really interesting when you find a book that really opens your mind to really critically thinking about something that you would love so much. It was a really interesting and sort of disorienting experience, particularly because like I'm also online, and this book really made me think about like my own behavior, but also like what I like in fiction, and made me start thinking about books in a different way, which is like, I know, a major thing to say. I think just on a personal level, this book really did a lot for me to really consider like my place as a book reviewer, how I approach reading books, and what I like in fiction, and even just like helps me think about new books in a way that I hadn't really thought about before, and really question my initial assumptions about what I'm reading in a way that helps me then hopefully be able to give you all better reviews and help me unpack my thoughts in a better way. If that makes any sense? Anyways, that's fake accounts. Okay, so this is hands down the longest video I've ever filmed, and I hope you enjoyed it. To hear me praising my favorite books, I really had fun like going through this and thinking about books that I read quite a while ago, and these are all books, some more than others, that I feel like immediately compelled to reread again. But initially, I'm going to start with Moshfegh and really see if she's my favorite writer. I think she is. So yeah, that vlog will be coming. And I'm actually coming up on 2 years on BookTube. And so it's kind of like a perfect time to really reflect on like what I've been doing on here. I've been thinking a lot about like, I'm a big overthinker. And so it's just fun to really think about like what I'm doing on here and like the books that I reviewed. I've reviewed so many on here, or talked about them at least, and it's just fun to think about the ones that really stay with me and why. And I like doing that as a personal exercise, and I hope you enjoy watching it as a viewer. And if you did, please give me a like, subscribe if you haven't already, share with your friends. Just kidding. Anyways, I will catch you all in the next one. Bye.